By the third truck before noon, with boxes stacked like a cardboard wall against my gate, I realized someone had turned my home into a warehouse without asking. I didn't know who yet, but I knew one thing immediately. Whoever did this was about to learn an expensive lesson. I live in a quiet neighborhood where nothing happens fast, which is why the sound of a diesel engine idling outside my bedroom window felt like an insult. I pulled back the curtain and saw a delivery van parked crookedly across my driveway, hazard lights blinking like it owned the place. A guy in a brown uniform was already unloading boxes, scanning labels, setting them down with the bored efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. I stepped outside in slippers and a hoodie, coffee still burning my tongue, and asked him who the packages were for. He glanced at his handheld scanner, then at me. "This address," he said, like that explained everything. The labels didn't have my name. They had a name I recognized immediately, because you don't forget someone like her. Karen. Mid-40s, permanently offended expression, lived 3 houses down, and chaired herself as if she were the self-appointed CEO of the entire street. She had complained about my fence height, my trash bin placement, my choice of mailbox, and once, memorably, the way my porch light was too aggressive. We were not friends. I told the driver those packages weren't mine. He shrugged, said he couldn't take them back because they were marked delivered to this address, and drove off before I could argue. I stood there staring at the boxes, a mix of confusion and irritation settling into my stomach. Maybe it was a one-off mistake. Maybe she'd mistyped something online. I carried them into my garage, planning to drop them off later, and went back to my day. The next day it happened again. Different company. More boxes. This time, one of them was heavy enough that the driver asked me to help move it. I told him, through clenched teeth, that I wasn't the recipient. He pointed at the address, apologized, and left. By noon, my garage looked like the back room of a retail store. I checked the labels more carefully. Same name. Same address. My address. That's when it clicked. This wasn't a typo. This was deliberate. Karen had done something similar years ago, registering herself as temporary parking enforcement and trying to ticket people on the street. She loved systems, loved paperwork, loved anything that let her feel powerful without actually earning it. Somewhere in her mind, redirecting her deliveries to my house probably felt clever. Convenient. Harmless. I could picture her thinking I'd just bring everything over, maybe even apologize for the inconvenience. I walked down to her house that afternoon with the first batch of boxes stacked in my arms. She answered the door with a smile that was already too smug to be genuine. Before I could say a word, she sighed dramatically and said, "Oh, thank goodness, I was wondering when you'd bring those over." I asked her why my address was on her deliveries. She didn't deny it. She adjusted her cardigan and said it was easier this way because delivery drivers always miss her porch, and that since I was home more often, it just made sense. She said it like she was explaining a household chore to a child. I told her she needed to change it immediately. She waved her hand and said she would, eventually, and closed the door while I was still standing there. That night, more packages arrived. Evening deliveries. One driver knocked, another didn't. A neighbor texted asking if I was running a business out of my garage. I called customer service for one of the companies and explained the situation. They apologized, said they'd make a note, but couldn't guarantee it wouldn't happen again unless the account holder changed the address. I already knew Karen wouldn't. By the end of the week, it was ridiculous. Boxes lined the garage wall. Some were small, some large, some clearly expensive. Electronics, home decor, specialty food items. One was a full-length mirror that nearly fell on my foot. Each label told the same story. Her name. My address. I went back to her house and knocked harder this time. She cracked the door and looked annoyed, as if I were interrupting something important. I told her this had gone too far. She leaned against the doorframe and said, with a thin smile, that legally the packages were delivered correctly, and if I didn't want them, I was free to return them myself. She suggested I stop being dramatic. That was the moment something shifted. The irritation burned off and left something colder behind. I realized she wasn't going to stop because there was no cost to her behavior. In her mind, inconvenience to me was invisible. Effort from her was unacceptable. She expected the system, and me, to absorb everything. So I stopped bringing the packages over. The next delivery arrived on a Saturday morning. I signed for it, not because I wanted to help, but because I wanted a record. I stacked it neatly with the others and took photos. I documented dates, times, companies, tracking numbers. I checked local regulations about misdelivered packages, storage liability, abandoned property. Turns out, when someone knowingly registers the wrong address and refuses to correct it, things get interesting. 3 days later, Karen showed up at my door, red-faced and furious. She demanded to know why her packages hadn't been delivered. I told her they had been. She pointed at my house like it was a crime scene and said I was stealing. I calmly told her she was welcome to retrieve them, during reasonable hours, by appointment. Her mouth opened and closed like she was buffering. She threatened the police. I told her to go ahead. She threatened to report me to every delivery company she used. I told her I had already spoken to them. She called me selfish, petty, and unethical. I smiled and reminded her that this was her system, not mine. As she stormed back down the driveway, I looked at the boxes stacked behind me and felt something close to satisfaction. She had tried to use my address as a convenience. What she didn't understand yet was that convenience always has a bill. And sooner or later, someone has to pay it. By Monday morning, the neighborhood knew something was wrong before Karen did. Delivery vans slowed in front of my house like it was a landmark. Drivers double-checked scanners, frowned, shrugged, and unloaded anyway. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand, not interfering, not correcting them, just observing. Every box was another entry in my growing folder of photos and timestamp. I wasn't hoarding out of spite. I was letting her system fully mature. Karen, meanwhile, spiraled. She rang my doorbell 3 times before noon. I didn't answer the first 2. On the third, she leaned on it like she was trying to flatten the button through the wood. When I finally opened the door, she launched straight into accusations. She said I was obstructing her life, sabotaging her deliveries, deliberately withholding her property. I let her finish. Then I calmly told her she could pick up any package addressed to her during a scheduled window, between 6 and 7 in the evening, 1 visit per day. Her face did something strange, like her brain was struggling to process the idea that she wasn't in charge. She demanded immediate access. I asked her to confirm, out loud, that she had intentionally registered my address for her deliveries. She hesitated. Just a flicker. Then she said yes because it was easier and that should be the end of it. I thanked her for clarifying and told her I'd noted it. That's when she realized she might have said too much. That afternoon, I received my first official email. One of the delivery companies followed up on my earlier call, asking for written confirmation that I was not the account holder and that the deliveries were unauthorized. I replied with photos, logs, and a short explanation. An hour later, another company did the same. Karen had built her little convenience on the assumption that no one would push back. She hadn't accounted for paperwork. The next escalation came from her, loud and public. She posted in the neighborhood group chat, claiming someone was stealing her packages and hinting heavily that it was me. She didn't name me directly at first, but she didn't have to. People started messaging me privately, asking what was going on. I sent each of them the same photo. A stack of boxes with her name and my address, timestamps visible. Most replies came back with variations of disbelief and laughter. A few asked if she was serious. By evening, she was standing on the sidewalk in front of my house, arms crossed, talking loudly on her phone about theft and criminal behavior. I stayed inside and let her perform. When she finally marched up and knocked again, I opened the door with my phone recording openly. She noticed immediately and changed her tone, switching from rage to wounded authority. She said she would allow me to redeem myself by bringing her packages over immediately. I told her that since she was already here, she could retrieve them herself, starting tomorrow, during the scheduled hour. She called me unreasonable. I told her she had redefined reasonable the moment she used my address without consent. She said she'd call the police. I told her I'd welcome an officer who could document the situation properly. That stopped her cold. She didn't want documentation. She wanted obedience. The police never came that night, but something else did. A freight delivery. A large one. The driver needed a signature and a clear space to unload. I signed, directed him to the driveway, and watched as a massive crate was lowered onto a pallet. The label showed her name in bold letters. Whatever was inside, it wasn't small, and it wasn't cheap. I could almost feel the moment Karen realized she'd lost control, even from 3 houses away. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated. Karen tried to intimidate, then plead, then threaten. I stayed consistent, calm, documented. I contacted the non-emergency line and asked about my obligations regarding property deliberately delivered to my address against my will. The answer was careful but enlightening. I was allowed to charge reasonable storage fees after notice. I was allowed to restrict access for safety and scheduling. I was allowed to protect myself. So I sent her a notice. Polite, clear, dated. It stated that any packages addressed to her and delivered to my property would incur a daily storage fee after 48 hours, and that retrieval required prior confirmation. I slid it into her mailbox and emailed a copy to the address she'd once used to complain about my porch light. She lost it. The shouting was audible from inside my house. She accused me of extortion, harassment, abuse of process. I reminded her, through the door, that she could stop everything instantly by changing one setting online. She screamed that she shouldn't have to. That was when I knew this wasn't just about packages to her anymore. This was about control. About a person who believed the world should bend to her preferences and was furious that it hadn't. Every box in my garage was now evidence of that belief. Every day she refused to fix it made the eventual fallout heavier. On Friday evening, as I locked the garage and updated my log, I felt a strange sense of calm. She had started something she couldn't finish, and she didn't even realize how deep she was yet. She thought inconvenience was the worst outcome. She had no idea how expensive her convenience was about to become. The invoice was the first thing that broke her illusion that this would blow over. I printed it on plain paper, nothing fancy, just dates, item counts, square footage used, and a modest daily storage rate that I'd double-checked against local guidelines. I slid it into an envelope and taped it to her door after sunset, not to be sneaky, but because I didn't feel like performing for her again. By morning, my phone was vibrating non-stop. She left 7 voicemails in under an hour. The first was disbelief. The second was laughter, sharp and forced. The third accused me of fraud. By the 5th, she was crying in that performative way people do when they think emotion can override fact. The last one was quiet and cold. She said she'd contacted a lawyer and I should expect consequences. I saved every message. That same day, 2 delivery companies flagged her account. Not shut down, but reviewed. I knew because both emailed me asking for additional confirmation. One asked if I would accept future deliveries addressed to her. I replied with a single sentence. No. Please return all future packages to sender. That's when the real costs started to accumulate, the kind that don't feel real until they hit a statement. Returned packages aren't free. Restocking fees. Shipping penalties. Delayed delivery charges. Items marked refused or undeliverable. Karen had been ordering with abandon for months, maybe longer, assuming the system would quietly absorb everything. Now the system was pushing back, and systems don't argue. They invoice. She tried a different tactic. The HOA. I came home one afternoon to a bright orange notice taped to my gate, claiming I was operating an unlicensed storage business. It cited bylaws that didn't apply to single-family residences and included a fine that wasn't authorized by anyone with actual authority. I recognized her phrasing immediately. The same dramatic capitalization. The same misuse of legal terms. I emailed the HOA board directly with photos, context, and a request for confirmation. 2 hours later, I got a reply apologizing for the confusion and stating no such violation existed. Karen had signed the notice herself. That evening, she stood across the street with 2 neighbors, gesturing wildly at my house like it was on fire. I didn't go outside. I watched from the window as one neighbor slowly backed away, uncomfortable, while the other nodded along, not fully understanding but enjoying the drama. When Karen noticed me watching, she waved like she'd caught me in the act of something terrible. I closed the blinds. The next escalation came wrapped in a uniform that didn't quite fit. A man knocked on my door mid-morning, wearing a badge that was just slightly off, the shine wrong, the lettering crooked. He introduced himself as private security contracted by the HOA. I asked for his credentials. He hesitated. I asked again. He said he was there to retrieve Karen's property. I told him he was trespassing and needed to leave. He raised his voice. I raised my phone. He left quickly. I called the HOA again. They confirmed they had not sent anyone. I documented that too. Karen had crossed from entitlement into something messier, something reckless. She was improvising authority, assuming no one would challenge it. She was wrong. Packages kept arriving for another week, slower now, but still steady. I refused them all. Drivers marked them accordingly. I received automated emails showing the chain reaction. Refused. Returned. Charged. I imagined her watching her account notifications pile up, each one a tiny shock, each one reminding her that she could stop this anytime by changing an address. She didn't. She doubled down. She filed a police report accusing me of mail theft. An officer showed up 2 days later, polite, tired, clearly expecting nonsense. I walked him through everything. The logs. The photos. The voicemails. The invoice. The HOA notice she'd fabricated. The fake security. He listened without interrupting, then asked a simple question. Had she acknowledged using my address intentionally? I played him the voicemail where she said it was easier that way. He exhaled slowly and nodded. He went to her house next. She didn't come over that night. She didn't come over the next day either. Instead, I got a certified letter from a lawyer threatening a civil claim for conversion of property. I read it twice, then smiled. It was boilerplate. Sloppy. It demanded immediate release of all packages and payment for damages without addressing the address issue at all. I forwarded it to the same delivery companies that had been emailing me, along with a note stating that any future attempts to deliver to my address should be considered harassment. The response was faster than I expected. One company suspended her account pending verification. Another required in-person ID confirmation before any new shipment. A third canceled several pending orders outright. Karen had turned convenience into friction, and friction into loss. The silence from her stretched on for 3 days. Then, on the 4th, she appeared at my door again, different this time. No shouting. No threats. Just exhaustion and a brittle smile. She said we needed to talk like adults. I asked her if she was there to confirm she'd changed the address. She said not yet, but she would, soon. I told her there was nothing left to discuss. As I closed the door, she said something that stuck with me. She said I was enjoying this. I didn't answer, but the truth was more complicated. I wasn't enjoying her distress. I was enjoying the clarity. The way systems work when you stop trying to be polite with people who rely on politeness to exploit others. That night, I updated my log one last time for the week and locked the garage, now empty. The boxes were gone, but the consequences were still moving, rippling outward in ways she couldn't intercept. She thought registering my address was a harmless shortcut. What she'd actually done was put her name on every mistake that followed. And the bill, finally, was coming due. Karen didn't change the address. That was the most baffling part. After everything, after the police visit, the account suspensions, the returned shipments, she still left it untouched, like stubbornness itself had become her last line of defense. I half expected a sudden apology or a sheepish message admitting defeat. Instead, what arrived was a new kind of chaos, quieter at first, then sharper. It started with certified mail. Not to me, but to her, delivered to my address and immediately flagged by the carrier because of the ongoing dispute. The postal worker knocked and asked if Karen lived here. I told her no. She nodded, made a note, and left. An hour later, my phone buzzed with an automated alert from one of the delivery companies confirming another refusal. Karen's paper trail was starting to look like a maze with no exit. That afternoon, she tried to corner me in public. I was loading groceries into my car when she appeared at the end of the driveway, blocking the sidewalk like a checkpoint. Her voice was calm, almost friendly, which was new and deeply suspicious. She said we were both adults, and that we could put this behind us if I'd just hand over whatever packages were still floating around. I told her there were none. She smiled tightly and said that wasn't what her tracking numbers showed. I asked her why, after weeks of consequences, she still hadn't fixed the address. She hesitated, then said something revealing. She said if she changed it now, it would look like she was admitting fault. The words hung in the air between us. This wasn't about convenience anymore. It was about ego, about preserving a version of herself where she was never wrong. She told me she'd spoken to a friend who worked in logistics, and that I was overestimating my position. She warned me that companies didn't like difficult customers and that my name was probably flagged too. I wished her luck and closed my trunk. As I drove away, I saw her standing there, arms crossed, staring like she was trying to will reality into compliance. The next escalation came from an unexpected angle. A city code enforcement officer left a card on my door asking me to call about a complaint. When I did, he explained someone had reported excessive commercial deliveries and improper storage on my property. I asked him to come by. When he arrived, I walked him through the garage, now empty, and showed him the documentation. He shook his head slowly and said he'd close the complaint. He also mentioned, casually, that repeated false reports could carry penalties. That evening, Karen posted again in the neighborhood group, this time more carefully worded. She claimed she was being targeted by a neighbor abusing loopholes and that she feared retaliation. The comments didn't go the way she wanted. Someone asked why she didn't just change the address. Someone else pointed out that delivery apps make it easy. A third joked that this sounded like a self-inflicted problem. Karen replied to none of them. Then the money problem surfaced. Not directly, but in fragments. I overheard her on the phone one morning, voice raised, talking about frozen funds and pending charges. A few days later, a tow truck idled outside her house longer than necessary. The driver left without taking anything, but the message lingered. Systems don't just invoice. They escalate. She tried one last gambit. Mediation. An email arrived from a local mediation service stating Karen had requested a session to resolve a neighbor dispute. I responded that I was open to mediation once she corrected the address and confirmed in writing that she had knowingly misused my property. The mediator replied that Karen felt those conditions were unreasonable. I declined to participate. That refusal seemed to break something. 2 days later, a delivery truck pulled up again, the first in week. The driver stepped out, looked at the address, and frowned. He knocked. I told him the situation. He checked his tablet and said the package required ID verification because the account was under review. He couldn't leave it without Karen present. He drove off. I watched from the porch as he turned the corner, taking with him whatever final hope she had of slipping something through. That night, she knocked on my door for the last time. She looked smaller somehow, like the anger had been holding her upright and now it was gone. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She said she'd changed the address and asked if I could confirm to the companies that everything was resolved. I asked her to show me proof. She pulled out her phone and scrolled, hands shaking slightly, and showed me the updated settings. I nodded. I told her I'd respond to any inquiries honestly. I also told her I'd be submitting my storage invoice formally, along with documentation of false reports and impersonation attempts, if she continued to escalate. She swallowed and nodded, eyes fixed on the ground. She asked if we could just forget the whole thing. I said forgetting wasn't part of the process. When she left, I felt something close to relief, but not quite. The conflict was winding down, but the consequences were still unfolding in places I couldn't see. Accounts had been flagged, records updated, notes attached to her name that wouldn't disappear overnight. She had finally changed the address, but the damage had already been distributed. A week later, the neighborhood was quiet again. No trucks, no shouting, no orange notices. I deleted the last draft of my log and archived the rest. The system had done what it always does when you let it. It recorded everything. Karen thought using my address would make her life easier. What she learned instead was that shortcuts leave traces, and traces add up. She stopped knocking. She stopped posting. She stopped pretending she was in control. And for the first time since this started, my driveway was just a driveway again. The quiet didn't mean it was over. It just meant the noise had moved somewhere else. For about 2 weeks after Karen changed the address, nothing happened. No trucks. No emails. No knocks. I almost started to believe the story had reached its natural end, the way conflicts sometimes do when one side finally realizes they've lost. I went back to using my garage like a normal person instead of an evidence locker. I stopped checking tracking alerts out of habit. Life resumed its usual rhythm. That's when the letter arrived. Not an email, not a notice taped to my door. A real envelope, thick, formal, addressed to me by name. Inside was a demand for payment. Karen was claiming damages. According to her, my refusal to release her packages in a timely manner had caused her financial loss, emotional distress, and reputational harm. She wanted compensation. A lot of it. The number was high enough that it stopped being insulting and started being funny. I read it twice, then a third time, slower. The letter conveniently skipped over the part where she had admitted, in writing and on voicemail, that she intentionally used my address. It ignored the police visit, the HOA fabrication, the fake security, the storage notice. It framed the entire situation as me maliciously interfering with her property for personal gain. It ended with a deadline and the promise of legal action. I didn't respond right away. I forwarded it to my attorney instead, along with the entire digital folder I'd built over the past month. He called me later that evening and laughed, not unkindly, just genuinely amused. He said the letter read like someone who had watched too many courtroom dramas and thought confidence could substitute for fact. He also said something important. He said this wasn't a threat. It was a mistake. Because when someone threatens legal action, they invite scrutiny. And Karen's trail was not the kind you want examined under fluorescent lighting. My attorney drafted a response that was calm, factual, and devastating in its simplicity. It outlined her intentional misrepresentation, included timestamps, transcripts, and copies of official responses, and politely stated that any further contact outside formal legal channels would be considered harassment. It also included an invoice. My invoice. Storage fees. Time spent resolving false reports. Legal consultation costs. All documented. All reasonable. The deadline on mine was sooner than hers. She responded the next day, not through her lawyer, but directly. The email was frantic, disorganized, full of half-finished thoughts and emotional swings. She accused me of escalating things unnecessarily, then begged me to reconsider, then threatened again, then apologized, all in the span of 6 paragraphs. It was the written equivalent of someone pacing back and forth, arguing with themselves. I didn't reply. Instead, something else happened. One of the delivery companies called me. Not customer service, but an account specialist. They told me Karen had disputed several charges related to returned packages and storage penalties, claiming fraud. During the review, my documentation had been pulled again. The specialist asked if I would be willing to provide a statement confirming that Karen had knowingly used my address without consent. I said yes. I sent it within the hour. 2 days later, her dispute was denied. That denial triggered another cascade. Accounts that had been under review moved into restriction. A promotional balance she'd been using was revoked. A bulk order discount she'd relied on disappeared. I didn't know the details then, but I could see the effects. The sudden sale sign in her yard. The whispered argument I overheard through an open window one evening. The way she stopped making eye contact with anyone on the street. She tried mediation again, this time framed as a compromise. The mediator contacted me and said Karen was willing to let go of the past, if we both agreed to drop all claims. I asked if she was also willing to withdraw her demand letter and pay the outstanding invoice. The mediator paused, then said Karen felt that would be unfair. I declined again. The pressure started coming from unexpected places. Mutual acquaintances. A neighbor who suggested I be the bigger person. Someone else who said Karen was having a hard time and maybe I should just let it go. I listened politely and said the same thing every time. This wasn't about punishment. It was about accountability. I hadn't chased her. I hadn't retaliated. I had simply stopped absorbing the cost of her choices. One afternoon, as I was getting the mail, I noticed something small but telling. A new mailbox had been installed at her house. Larger. Clearly marked. The kind people get when they expect a lot of deliveries. It sat there unused, a quiet monument to bad decisions. The final push came when my attorney called again. He said Karen's lawyer had quietly withdrawn. No explanation, just a notice of termination. He said that usually happened when a client insisted on a narrative that couldn't survive evidence. He asked me how I wanted to proceed. I told him to proceed exactly as planned. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because I felt victorious, but because the uncertainty was gone. Karen had tried to flip the story, to turn herself into the wronged party. But stories don't change just because someone demands they do. They change when facts support them. And hers didn't. The next chapter wasn't going to be loud. It wasn't going to involve shouting or threats or dramatic confrontations. It was going to happen quietly, in offices and inboxes and systems that don't care how indignant you feel. Karen had spent weeks trying to make me pay for her convenience. Now she was about to learn what it costs to fight a paper trail you created yourself. She was fighting the consequences, and those don't get tired, don't feel sympathy, and don't back down just because someone insists they're being treated unfairly. The first sign was the court notice. It wasn't a lawsuit, not yet. It was a scheduling notice tied to her demand letter, a mandatory pre-filing review meant to determine whether her claim even qualified to move forward. She had triggered it by pushing after her lawyer withdrew, filing paperwork on her own. I received the notice because I was named in the complaint. She received it because she'd asked for it. People who thrive on confrontation often believe escalation is power. They think making something official will scare the other person into folding. What they don't realize is that official processes strip away performance. There's no audience, no volume advantage, just facts, dates, and documentation. I attended the review remotely, camera on, notes ready. Karen joined late, flustered, framed badly on her screen, papers scattered around her like props she hadn't rehearsed with. The mediator explained the purpose of the session and asked her to summarize her claim. She launched into a story that sounded convincing if you ignored every inconvenient detail. She talked about delayed packages, emotional distress, malicious intent. She used words like hostage and exploitation. Then the mediator asked her a single question. Why was her name attached to an address that wasn't hers? She said it was a mistake. A temporary one. Something she'd meant to fix. I was asked to respond. I didn't argue. I shared my screen. I showed the delivery logs, the photos, the timestamps, the voicemail where she said it was easier that way, the HOA notice she'd signed herself, the email where she admitted she hadn't changed the address because it would look like admitting fault. The mediator didn't interrupt. Karen did, repeatedly, each time making things worse. When it was over, the mediator said the words Karen clearly hadn't expected to hear. He said her claim lacked merit. He said pursuing it further could expose her to counterclaims. He said he strongly recommended she withdraw. The call ended abruptly. Karen disconnected without a word. That should have been the end of it, but entitlement doesn't evaporate. It mutates. Within days, I started receiving misdirected mail again. Not packages this time, but bills. Past due notices. Final warnings. They weren't addressed to me, but they came to my house. Her house number was correct now, but the street name wasn't. She'd overcorrected, and in her rush to fix the problem, she'd created a new one. I returned them marked not at this address. Every single one. One envelope caught my attention before I sent it back. A notice from a shipping company outlining account termination due to repeated violations and unpaid balances. The language was clinical, permanent. Karen had lost access to the system she'd abused. Around the same time, the neighborhood shifted. People stopped engaging with her. Invitations dried up. Conversations ended when she approached. I didn't tell anyone what to think, but stories travel, especially when they involve audacity and self-inflicted damage. The myth she tried to build, that she was a victim of some elaborate scheme, collapsed under its own weight. She tried reaching out one last time. Not with threats, not with demands, but with a message that was almost reasonable. She said she'd been under stress. She said she hadn't meant for things to go so far. She said she hoped we could move forward without further complications. I read it carefully, then forwarded it to my attorney and archived it. Because moving forward doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. It means not allowing it to happen again. The final blow came quietly, the way real consequences usually do. A small claims notice arrived, not against me, but against her. One of the companies she'd disputed charges with was seeking recovery. Not a dramatic amount. Just enough to matter. Enough to sting. Enough to put her name into another system she couldn't charm her way out of. I never saw her come to my door again after that. No more notes. No more messages. No more performances. Her house went on the market shortly after. When the sign appeared, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph. Not relief. Just a sense of closure. Like watching a storm move on after tearing through the landscape, leaving things damaged but quiet. Karen had tried to use my address as a shortcut. She'd tried to offload inconvenience, responsibility, and effort onto someone she thought wouldn't push back. What she learned instead was that systems remember, and once they do, they don't forget just because you want them to. By the end of Chapter 6, the conflict wasn't burning anymore. It was cooling into something permanent, a record she'd carry long after she left the street. And the bill she'd been trying to dodge all along was finally being paid, one line item at a time. The house didn't sell right away. That was the first thing that surprised me. The sign went up, then nothing happened. No open houses. No weekend traffic. Just the same sign slowly fading in the sun, corners curling like it already regretted being there. Karen still lived inside, but she moved through the neighborhood like a ghost, visible but avoided, as if everyone had silently agreed not to invite the drama back in. I thought that would be the end of my involvement. I was wrong. The call came from my attorney late one afternoon. He sounded calm, but there was an edge of disbelief in his voice. He told me Karen had filed a counter-complaint with a consumer protection agency, claiming predatory behavior, emotional coercion, and unlawful storage fees. It was thinner than her previous attempts, but it had one dangerous quality. It dragged my name into a system that didn't move quickly. This wasn't about winning anymore. This was about exhaustion. The agency sent a formal inquiry requesting my response. I didn't panic. I didn't rush. I sent the same packet I'd sent everywhere else, updated with the mediator's notes and the withdrawn claim. I attached one extra document this time, a timeline clean and factual, starting from the first delivery truck to the moment she finally changed the address. No commentary. No emotion. Just cause and effect. Weeks passed. In that time, Karen tried something new. She started telling people a revised version of the story. According to her, the deliveries had been accidental. According to her, I'd taken advantage of a misunderstanding. According to her, I'd turned a neighborly issue into a legal nightmare because I enjoyed control. The story shifted depending on who she talked to, but it always ended with her as the reasonable one. The problem was that stories only work when there isn't documentation. One of the people she tried to convince was the wrong person. A neighbor who worked in compliance, someone who understood how investigations work. That neighbor reached out to me quietly and asked if what Karen was saying was true. I sent her the same packet. The neighbor didn't respond right away. The next time I saw Karen, she was shouting on her front porch, phone pressed to her ear, face flushed with anger. The agency closed the inquiry 2 days later. The letter was brief. It stated that after review, no violation was found on my part and that Karen's complaint was unsubstantiated. It also noted that repeated false filings could result in penalties. I forwarded the letter to my attorney and archived it like the rest. That should have been the last thread she could pull. But people who build their identity around being wronged don't let go easily. They look for one final lever, something emotional, something public. Karen found hers at a neighborhood meeting. I didn't attend. I heard about it later, from 3 different people who told the story almost the same way. She stood up during the open comment period and tried to frame the entire situation as a warning about what happens when neighbors weaponize systems against each other. She spoke dramatically about fear, about harassment, about feeling unsafe. She implied, without naming me, that someone on the street was dangerous. Then someone asked a question. Why didn't she just change the address? There was a pause. Long enough to feel uncomfortable. Long enough for people to look at each other. Karen answered that it wasn't that simple. Someone else pulled up a delivery app on their phone and showed how it took less than 30 seconds. Another person asked why she'd sent fake security. Another asked about the police visit. The meeting chair tried to move things along, but it was too late. The narrative cracked in public. Karen left early. A week later, the for sale sign came down. Not because the house sold, but because it was being rented instead. The listing showed up online quietly, price reduced, description vague. She was leaving, just not in the way she'd planned. On her last full day on the street, a moving truck parked in front of her house. I watched from my window, not out of spite, but because closure has a way of pulling your attention whether you want it or not. She supervised the loading with forced authority, snapping instructions that no one listened to. At one point, she looked toward my house. Our eyes met through the glass. She didn't glare. She didn't scowl. She looked tired. That was when I understood something important. This had never really been about me. I was just the first boundary she hit that didn't move. Everything that followed came from her refusal to accept that. The truck pulled away in the late afternoon. The street went quiet again. The kind of quiet that feels earned. I thought that was the end. I really did. But consequences don't always finish at the same time the conflict does. Sometimes they lag, waiting for the right moment to land. And Karen still had one more bill coming, even if she didn't know it yet. The final consequence arrived 6 weeks after the moving truck left, tucked into my mailbox on an ordinary Tuesday like it didn't understand how long it had been traveling to reach me. It was a notice from the small claims clerk, addressed correctly this time, informing me that a hearing I hadn't requested had concluded in my favor by default. Karen hadn't shown up. She hadn't filed a response. She hadn't asked for an extension. The clerk attached the order, brief and unmistakable, stating that my documented storage fees and associated costs were valid, enforceable, and now part of a judgment. The amount wasn't life-changing. It didn't need to be. It was enough to matter, enough to follow her, enough to be remembered. I sat at the kitchen table and read it twice, not because I doubted it, but because of the strange calm that comes when something is finally finished. There was no spike of joy, no rush of vindication. Just the quiet certainty that the line had been crossed and then closed. I didn't have to collect it myself. That part surprised me. The court handled the next steps automatically. Notices sent. Deadlines set. Options outlined. Karen could pay, contest, or ignore it and let it mature into something heavier. Given her history, I suspected she'd do what she always did and hope the system would blink first. It didn't. A week later, I received confirmation that she'd paid the judgment in full. No note. No apology. Just a transaction number and a date stamp. The money hit my account and sat there, oddly inert, like it wasn't the point at all. That same week, another thing happened, quieter but more lasting. One of the delivery companies sent a final follow-up. They thanked me for my cooperation and confirmed that the address flag had been resolved permanently. Karen's name, they explained, had been restricted across their network due to repeated policy violations. Appeals exhausted. Decision final. It was written in neutral language, but the meaning was clear. The door she'd abused was now closed to her everywhere it mattered. The neighborhood moved on faster than I expected. New renters arrived. Different cars. Different routines. The space Karen had occupied filled in, softened, became normal again. People waved. Packages arrived where they were supposed to. The street reclaimed its anonymity. Every once in a while, someone would ask me what had really happened, usually in that careful way people use when they don't want gossip but still want the story. I told them the truth, stripped of drama. Someone used my address without permission. I set boundaries. Systems did the rest. That was usually enough. Months passed. I stopped thinking about tracking numbers and timestamp. The folder on my computer stayed archived, untouched, a relic of a time when documentation felt like armor. I returned to ordinary inconveniences, the kind that don't come with invoices or hearings. Life regained its texture. Then, one afternoon, I ran into Karen by accident. It was at a grocery store across town, the kind you only visit when you're already out of your way. I almost didn't recognize her. Different haircut. Different posture. She stood in the produce aisle staring at a shelf like it had personally offended her, then turned and saw me. There was a moment, sharp and awkward, where we both decided what kind of people we were going to be. She spoke first. She said my name, carefully, like it might still have power. She said she hoped I was doing well. I said I was. She nodded, eyes flicking away, then back again. She said the whole thing had gotten out of hand. I agreed. She said she wished it hadn't gone so far. I said choices have momentum. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize either. She just sighed, the long, tired kind, and said she'd learned a lot about how unforgiving systems can be. I told her systems aren't unforgiving. They're precise. They only feel cruel when you expect exceptions. She gave a thin smile at that, the kind you use when you don't like the truth but can't refute it. Then she picked up her basket and walked away. I stood there for a moment longer, listening to the hum of the store, the ordinary noise of carts and conversations, and felt something settle. Not closure exactly, but acceptance. The understanding that some people don't change so much as they collide with the edge of what they can get away with. Driving home, I passed my street and noticed how unremarkable it looked. No signs. No trucks. No drama. Just houses and trees and driveways doing their quiet work. My driveway, especially, empty and unclaimed. That's the thing Karen never understood. She thought using my address was harmless because she saw addresses as abstract, interchangeable, something you could borrow without asking. She didn't see the labor behind them. The accountability. The way a place anchors responsibility whether you like it or not. When she registered my address, she thought she was outsourcing inconvenience. What she actually did was attach her name to every consequence that followed. Every returned package. Every fee. Every flag. Every note in a system that doesn't forget because it doesn't feel. I didn't make her pay for every package by being clever or cruel. I made her pay by refusing to absorb the cost of her entitlement. By standing still while she ran headfirst into rules she assumed wouldn't apply to her. In the end, there was no dramatic final showdown. No shouting match. No grand apology. Just a series of quiet confirmations that boundaries, once enforced, have weight. My address is mine again. My driveway stays clear. And somewhere out there, Karen is entering her information more carefully, aware now that shortcuts leave marks, and marks add up. That was the real payment. Not the money. Not the judgment. The lesson that convenience borrowed without consent always comes due, and the bill never goes to the person who said no.